and for attending this evening's expert next door. My name is Andrew Collier, and I'm on the Board of Trustees for the Saratoga County History Center, and I chair the membership committee. As an organization, we are able to put on events like this because of our strong membership participation. 2021 was an exciting year at Saratoga County History Center at Brookside. We added 5 new exhibits. We made significant progress on our collection, raised over $31,000 for improvements to Brookside, and we saw a 240% increase in our membership. As Brookside grows, we encourage you to become a member of our family. Memberships vary in price, with our senior memberships for $25, individual memberships for $35, all the way up to $5,000 for a lifetime membership. Our members are really helping Brookside grow, put on great events like this, bring in excellent guest speakers, and help keep history in Saratoga County alive. So I encourage all of you to head to our website at brooksidemuseum.org, which I'll share in the chat box, and check out our new membership levels and benefits as we recently updated them last month. If you're not a member, we hope you become a member today, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Back to you, Anne.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew. And again, information on that can be found on our website, brooksidemuseum.org. Now, a couple of things I want to mention. We have a couple of little housekeeping things that I always try to mention. We'll ask that everyone try to keep themselves on mute. And so that is to prevent interruptions, be it the doorbell or a dog barking or things like that. And so that'll allow our presenter to focus. And so also, we're going to ask that questions be held to the end, and something a little bit different from what we've been doing lately, since this is a little bit different of a type of program. We're going to ask that you ask questions, and you can do that in the chat, or once the program is finished up, if needed, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, you can. We're going to ask that you start by asking questions to Frederick Grant, circa 1885. And after that, once we've had a chance to interact with our presenter in character, then we can discuss a little bit more about the modern viewpoints of Grant, of the Cottage, and things like that. So that's a little bit of the housekeeping there. And another thing, we are recording this evening, so do keep that in mind. But I'm very happy to welcome this evening Ben Kemp, who works at Grant's Cottage as the operations manager. And he has been up there for a number of years, and we've really enjoyed working with Ben on a number of occasions. But this is a new opportunity for us to work with Frederick Grant. And I'm going to turn things over to Frederick, and he can far better introduce himself and share some information this evening. Thank you so much for being here.
It is wonderful to see so many of you have come out in this time of great grief for my family and I. I have no illusions that you have come out to see me. I realize that it is my illustrious father, sadly, the late General Grant. But I know from this recent outpouring of national grief how much my father was loved by this nation. I grieve alongside you as a grateful citizen, but I also have the private grief of a son. As my father's public accomplishments are well known, it will be my endeavor this evening to give you just a glimpse into the man I knew, a loving and devoted family man, always the most comfortable in the family circle. My mind wanders back to the earliest memories that I have. I remember being a boy of about 4 years of age, and I was born and raised in my early years on the Dent family property. That was my mother's parents, outside of St. Louis, Missouri, a place called Whitehaven. And it was a beautiful estate. All of us children enjoyed it. But as a 4-year-old boy, I met a man coming down the lane to our home. And something in me, even at that young age, seemed to recognize him. But I did not know why. And as he got closer, he also began to recognize me. That moment that I saw my father for the first time in 2 years will stay with me forever. It was such a happy reunion. My father, who had been assigned to the West Coast to military duty there, was now reunited with us, having been separated for 2 years. He had not even met my brother, who had been born in his absence, Ulysses, his namesake. For my father, of course, it was a great relief as well. I noticed something else about my father from that time onward. He had a distinct fear of being separated from us again. That loneliness that he felt, that I can only imagine, the loneliness gnawed at him at that remote outpost in California. And he never wanted to feel that again. Because if my father was anything, he was a family man. I recall a story told later to me that my mother, who did not write my father as much as he wished to be written to in those lonely years, but one letter deeply affected my father and showed just how much he missed his little family in St. Louis. The letter arrived to my father, and it was told to me by a comrade in arms of his later on, that he opened the letter and he began to weep. And that was not typical of my father. And he handed the letter to his fellow soldier. And it contained a tracing of my little brother's hand. My father took great pride in me as his eldest son. He encouraged me in everything that I did. In those early years, he taught me horseback riding, shooting, swimming, how to drive the carriage, all the things that a young boy should learn. But he did it with patience. But he expected independence from me as the eldest. There is many things that are said about my father's time in St. Louis, many stories of struggle and hardship. And though there is truth to that, they were happy times for our family, because my father could be with us every evening no matter how difficult the day was, and my father faced not just physical hardship, but also mental hardship in those days. He suffered from fevers and tremors, but he kept at his work. I recall the evenings, though, sitting by the fire, and my father loved to read. My mother, of course, has an eye condition, which makes it difficult for her to read. So my father always volunteered to read to us, and it was a great enjoyment and a great time of bonding for our family in those evenings spent at Whitehaven. I remember when my father decided, and this showed a bit of his streak of independence, that he decided that he was going to build a cabin on the property, some of the land that my grandfather Dent had given to my mother, Julia. About 60 acres of land, and my father started to clear it, and with some of the lumber, he decided to build a log cabin. Now, it was a very difficult process. We had not much for means, not much for labor, but my father, even though, as I mentioned, he had health problems, he showed perseverance, and he put that cabin together, and we lived in it not for long, as circumstances would have it, but in watching him on the farm and building the cabin, I saw in him just an indomitable spirit and a perseverance in the face of adversity. This would be the beginning of a long journey of admiration and learning alongside my father. And I feel it was a privilege of my life, the great privilege of my life, to have been able to spend so much time with such a father. We had no schools close to Whitehaven at that time. We were quite a ways outside the city proper. And my father, a learned man himself who had studied at West Point Military Academy, he made sure that we had our lessons. Even during these difficult times, my father always made sure us children had nice things. I remember the first time we ever went to a circus. My father brought Ulysses and I to a circus. And of course, my father enjoyed the animals the most. Always loved the horses. My father, and we would be joined, our family would grow in these years at Whitehaven. My sister Ellen, we call her Nellie, and Jesse were born in these years. And my father would treat each of his children according to our personalities. I, of course, as I mentioned, was the eldest, so I was expected to be a bit more mature and brave and independent. My brother Ulysses, now we came to call him Buck, for he was born in Ohio, the Buckeye State. Buck, my father knew, was a bit more of a gentle boy, and he took that into account. He was gentle with him. Nellie, of course, it was his great pet. My father showered her with attention, of course, being his only daughter. And then Jesse. Well, Jesse, a very rambunctious youth, and certainly brought out the playful side of my father's nature. They were frequently facetious with each other and always trying to pull a prank on some other member of the family. Our families, the Grants and the Dents, did not always see eye to eye. And I would spend time with the Dents and with the Grants, and my father always had to tread the waters between the two families. Of course, my grandfather Dent was a Southern man, a slave owner, and my grandfather Grant was opposed to slavery. And those were not the only differences of opinion. So there were difficult times. But my father, whom I see as a peacemaker, kept the peace. I recall an amusing incident. As I mentioned, we were very doted on by my father in general, but we behaved ourselves because my father commanded our respect, but he did not do it through force. We did not want to disappoint him. That is why we respected him. But as children do, we occasionally were rambunctious and a little bit ambitious. It brings to mind a story of my brother, Ulysses, very young boy at the time. We had to move into St. Louis to a home there towards the end of our stay in that area. And my brother was brokenhearted. He had to leave our Newfoundland dog, Leo, at the farm. The city was no place for a dog such as Leo. My grandfather Dent thought of a scheme to make sure to lessen the blow to my brother. He promised my brother, he said, "It will not be a long journey for you to come back to the farm to visit your Leo. How about I give you $10 and you can come anytime you would like to visit?" Well, needless to say, my brother's mood changed quite distinctly when that $10 was mentioned. He seemed to somewhat forget his dog at the moment. And the next day we had moved into our home in the city. But as we all came down for breakfast the following morning, there was something curious. My brother was missing. He was always at breakfast, very punctual. And we were just about to go on a search for him when we heard a commotion at the back door. Well, we went to see what was the matter and opened the door, and there was my brother Ulysses, our household servant, and 7 of the neighborhood dogs. Well, it turns out my brother believed, and this must have been an early entrepreneurial spirit, that he would receive quite a big payday. Needless to say, he did not. And the dogs were returned. It was soon after that our family moved to Galena, Illinois. And if you've ever been to Galena, Illinois, it is a beautiful riverside city, but it is built on a very steep slope. And our home was a lovely little brick home up on the bluffs, and we were comfortable there. My father took up work in my grandfather's leather goods outlet there, and we lived comfortably. And the stories still persist of my father hating his work there or having a terrible time of it. But I can tell you that that was not the case. Our life there was happy. My father every evening was able to return home. One of the things I recall about our time in Galena was the playful nature that I had mentioned with my brother Jesse. He was still just a small tot at this time, and my father worked on Main Street, which is down by the river Now, he would have to make an ascent through stairs and very steep grades to make his way home every evening. Almost invariably, when he arrived half breathless to our home, to our dooryard, my little brother, Jesse, would come bursting out of the home, and he'd put his little fists up and he would say to my father, "Mister, do you want to fight?" My father would say back to him facetiously, "Well, Jesse, you know I am a man of peace. I do not desire to fight you, but I refuse to be hectored by a man of your size." They would, of course, end up in a wrestling match on the ground, and invariably my brother would emerge the victor. He always took time out for us children, even to engage in our play, crafting paper boats to send down the gutters in front of our home. Little memories. These are the little memories that come back to me, and I cherish them. But then war came, and it disrupted homes all across our land, and ours was no exception. As much as my father hated war, he knew it was his duty, and he would not be held back. Even though his initial attempts at being placed in the regular army were unfruitful, he persisted. He was going to serve. I was a tender boy of 11 as my father received his commission and prepared to go off to war. And as a boy that knew nothing of war, I believed that it would be a great adventure. My father was very hesitant, very concerned for me at that age. But he took me for some of the early maneuvers and marching and camping. But as soon as he thought danger may be near, he sent me home. Surprising to my father that my mother actually sent a letter to him stating that she believed that my place was with him at the front. And so I would spend much time with my father during the war. And I learned much about war. I recall one of the most memorable episodes of the war. And it was a defining moment in my relationship with my father. I recall that we were on a steamship on the Mississippi just prior to the Vicksburg campaign, and my father instructed me not to leave the boat. I fell asleep and awakened, and he was not present on the boat, and he had gone to the front, I was told, and I was not to leave the boat because that was my directions, and it would not be safe for me at the front. Well, as a boy, young boy, and a bit precocious, I decided that I would find my way off that vessel, and I would find my way to my father. So I did find a ruse to escape that vessel. As soon as my feet landed on the dry ground, however, I realized what I had done to myself. I realized now that I was quite some distance, quite some number of miles from my father's headquarters, and I was not sure of the exact route. So I started walking towards the sound of battle, and hours went by as I walked and grew weary. Evening came on, and I recall running into the most terrible scene I had ever encountered in my young life, and something that will be seared in my memory forever, and is seared into the memory of many veterans. I stumbled upon a field hospital. I can hear them today, the cries of the men, the cries of agony, the sight of blood and gore. It's enough to turn any man's stomach. It was too much to bear at my young age, and I cowered under a tree and prayed for dawn. This boy, my innocence has been broken. I recalled reading books about the glory of war and believed it was a romance. My father had told me otherwise. My father had been through the Mexican War already, and he had told me the realities, but of course a boy wants to believe the fantasies. But that night, there were no more illusions of what war was. And I knew what my father meant when he said there was no glory to war. About daybreak, one of my father's staff members found me. Now, he brought me directly to my father's headquarters. And I remember seeing my father sitting, coolly smoking a cigar, having his morning cup of coffee, and I fully expected punishment for my misbehavior. Instead of a stern look from my father, I noticed that he had a bit of a quizzical look on his face, and first thing out of his mouth was, "How did you get here?" Well, I said, still believing I was in for punishment, I said, "Well, I walked mostly." And what he said next didn't seem to make sense to me at the moment, but over the years, I understood it more and more. He looked at me and he said, "I guess you'll do." There was no punishment. And it later occurred to me that I believe at that moment, my father saw something of himself in me. He saw a boy that refused to be separated from his father, just as he refused to be separated from his family. He understood the pain of separation and what that can drive a man to do. For anybody that believes that living at the war front is a breeze, I can tell you that I experienced it all. I lost 40 pounds with dysentery. I had a tooth pulled. I spent much time in my father's headquarters tent due to these circumstances, and I had an ability to see him and how he worked, and it was amazing to watch his work ethic, his dedication to his duty, and his absolute disregard for his own comfort or safety. I remember my father for weeks, even suffering from a stomach ailment, still insisted that his men be taken care of before himself, because he had been sleeping on a cot that was ripped. He had to spread his legs across the sides to make sure he did not fall through. My father always cared of his men before himself. In fact, in general, my father put others before himself. These were the lessons I was learning from my father just by being with him and witnessing his character. Now, of course, he indulged me even during the war. He indulged me and gave me a nice pony, and I was allowed to wear a uniform and parade around with a sash. And I thought much of myself, of course. And his soldiers, the boys, they loved to have me around in camp. And I found after spending time with the soldiers that they ate better than my father's mess did. So many times I would actually eat with the soldiers instead. I was grazed by a bullet during the fighting at one point. I, of course, believed that it was a serious wound, and it was on my leg. And I remember an officer coming up to me and saying, I remember saying frantically, "I am killed." And the officer said, "Move your toes," which I did. And it was found later that it was a very slight wound. My father, of course, always showed great concern for any injury. But once he was sure that it was not a serious wound, he himself took in some casual joshing of me. But the war did take quite a toll on my body, and I was sent home to St. Louis, where I nearly died of a serious case of pneumonia. When it was feared that I may die, my father broke away from the war front and came home. Luckily, I was recovering by the time he arrived and not in a casket. But it certainly showed that my father put family first. I remember early in '64 going to Washington. President Lincoln gave my father his promotion. And I was impressed by the whole scene, of course. This was quite a scene with a number of people, the crowds and the cheering. But what impressed me most was the interaction between my father and the president. With all this adoration and all this praise being given to my father and attention, I saw no change in him. He was the same simple, honest, humble man in the midst of it. In fact, I remember my father being shy and being so uncomfortable in these circumstances due to his modesty that he would get flushed in the face and would take any excuse not to have to be in front of the public unless he felt he was injuring or offending someone. The family moved to New Jersey, but I did not spend much time in this small home we rented in New Jersey. I spent time with my father at City Point. And I recall an incident that was very traumatic for me, but for my father, it ended up being quite a humorous episode. I remember I was permitted to go duck hunting with a servant, and we went out in a small boat into the bay near headquarters, and we did not have any proof of our identities or uniforms or any of the like. And we were approached by a Union naval picket. And of course, we were challenged, as all were, and we claimed to be Union, but we could not prove it. I, of course, was terrified. I believe I blurted out, "Do you not know who I am? I am the son of General Grant himself." But they did not take my word for it. For isn't that what a spy would say? Well, we were taken to my father's headquarters, and I believe I even remember him forgetting that I was his son for a time. But he vouched for me, of course, but he certainly took the opportunity to tease me later. He said I was lucky I had not been hanged at the yardarm and my body tossed overboard. There was a time in the war I recall that Admiral Porter, we were under fire on one of his gunboats, and he had lost one of his gunners, and he turned to me and said, "Why don't you man it?" And I said to him, "I don't believe my father would approve of me joining the Navy." It is interesting how sometimes, even in the heat and terror of battle, that we can find humor. The magnanimity of my father at Appomattox was something that taught me a great lesson. I had heard in the camps the boys speak of the rebels, the Confederates, as terrible enemies and less than people. But my father always saw his foes as Americans. He never hated the Southerners. Some of our family was from the South. My father, all he wanted was to unite and heal our nation. Now, my father never held any political aspirations for himself after the war closed, but he did take the presidency, and I believe he did so because he wanted to make sure that the sacrifices of all those men had not been for nothing. He wanted to preserve and advance the results of the war. I remember the sensitive side of my father coming out in the spring of '74. My sister, 18 years of age, decided to marry. My father was not heartbroken at her marriage, but it was because she married an Englishman and she was going to move to England. And to have his darling Nellie move away was too much for him. He wept at the ceremony, and later we found him in private in the White House in one of the rooms, weeping bitterly. They would keep up a very close correspondence, and their bond would never be broken just by distance. But it showed how much my father did not want to be separated from his children ever. My daughter was born. I was married later that year in '74 to my lovely wife, Ida, who was taken in and treated by my parents just as their own. And I remember my daughter, Julia, being born in '76. I had narrowly escaped the disastrous Battle of Little Bighorn because of my being recalled for my daughter's birth. My parents always loved my children. Their grandchildren to them were enormous blessings, and they spent much time with them and showered them with attention and gifts. My little boy, Ulysses, was born in '81. I had spent time with my father on his world tour, and what I remember most about that, it was an adventure for us all, but I remember that my father frequently engaged speaking with other world leaders, great leaders of this world. And they all, many of them, wanted to speak on his military accomplishments. But my father was determined to speak on peace, because at heart, my father was a man of peace, and he promoted international arbitration and any way, as he said, to avoid the drawing of the sword. World peace was a vision for my father, and he would advocate for it to his final year. We had a few happy years. We were able to spend time in the place that we had summered during my father's presidential years, a place known as Long Branch. And we had a seaside cottage there. And it was a wonderful place for all the family to gather. My sister would come back from England, a great gathering place. And my father would say of when we were all together, that was when his treasures were all together. My brother, I remember an amusing incident about my brother. I'm sorry, not my brother, my son, Ulysses, the little one. He fancied himself a gardener. He was only a boy of 2 years of age, but my grandparents wanted to humor him. So they decided upon a scheme that would eventually backfire on them. And they decided that they would have him plant melon seeds in the garden in front of our cottage. And they did so. And then they knew that the little boy would have no patience. And so they bought a melon and they hid it. But the next morning, before Ulysses came to check on his little garden, they made sure to put the melon there. Well, he was so overjoyed that his grandmama, Julia, decided that he would get a dime for that melon. So the dime was exchanged for the melon, but then there was an expectation. The expectation was set that a seed would be planted and a melon grown every day. That was what became known as the magic melon story of Long Branch. My parents were playful with each other as well. I recall an incident where my father was teasing my mother because my brother Ulysses jumped over the railing of the cottage, and my father looked to my mother and he said, "Well, if there was a fire, how would you save yourself?" "You would not be able to save yourself. I would have to help you." Well, she looked very indignant and she said, I can leap that railing, and she did so. And she made sure to give him quite the look after she did. Our final year was a great struggle. The failure of the firm Grant and Ward hit our family like a bombshell. As you can imagine, it devastated us both financially, but also my father emotionally. He had trusted our friend at the time, of course, not anymore, but Mr. Ward was somebody that my father had given so much trust to. He'd taken him in almost as a son. And this was such a bitter betrayal that my father had to swallow. He focused on taking care of us instead. But this is also when the throat pain would come on that would eventually take his life. And I remember how hard he struggled last winter on his book. And I recall when he wrote the dedication of his book, it was in our New York home, and he wrote, "To the American soldier and sailor," and I brought it up to my father. I said, "Do you not want to specify that this is to the Union or US soldiers only?" He said, "No." He told me that this book will live on beyond his years, and he hoped that it could play just a small role in creating harmony between former foes. It was touching to watch the veterans pass on the street below our 66th Street home, marching past, looking up at my father in the window. They knew it would be the last that they saw of him. He had a great love for the veterans, and they a great love of him. I remember his last message to the Grand Army. He said, "Tell the men they may never see my face again, but they are engraven on my heart, and I love them as my children." I helped my father, And I had to be the spokesman for our family over these trying months of my father's illness. But every time I felt myself wavering in strength, I would look upon my father and know, just know the struggle that he went through. And he did so stoically and so bravely. And I would think nothing more of my own struggle. We came to Mount McGregor, a cottage offered to us by Mr. Drexel. And we were very grateful for this healthy place to flee from the city and its heat and stale air. And it was a beautiful place. And I believe it lengthened my father's life, as did the tender care of my father's doctors, of which we are greatly indebted. But it also gave my father a time to finish his book, but also to meet with some individuals. My father's faith in humanity had been shaken by the scandal that rocked our family the year before. And my father, during the worst of the days, financially, had received a check from a man named Charles Wood of Troy, New York. And Charles Wood had given us this money as a loan. He knew my father would not take charity, so he gave it to him as a loan, and my father accepted it gratefully, and he paid him back. Mr. Wood was allowed to see my father on the porch of the cottage there on the mountain. And I recall, after the brief meeting, my father sadly was communicating with pieces of paper at this time because his voice had left him. Mr. Wood was leaving the porch and he had tears in his eyes. And I approached him and he simply handed the note to me. And it seems as though the note indicated that my father's faith in humanity had been restored. He said in it, "I am glad to say that while there is much unblushing wickedness in this world, yet there is a compensating generosity and grandeur of the soul." Another visitor, only 2 weeks before my father's death, seemed to answer his call for peace. Simon Buckner, Confederate general, enemy of my father's, forced to surrender to him during the war even, came to visit, and my father was glad to see him, even though his condition was very desperate. They met for an hour, spoke of the old days. General Buckner gave him the support of the Confederate veterans, which meant everything to my father. My father wrote some healing words, important words about unity to Buckner. Buckner left the home, and I remember the press accosted him for the contents of the notes. And Buckner refused at first, but later my father sent word and he said, "Give them the notes. It will only do good. It will only serve to heal our nation." That was my father's final wish, that this nation that he loved, that he gave so much to, would heal. And we have appreciated, our family, the amazing outpouring of condolences that have arrived since my father's death. It has helped assuage the pain. And this coming together, these messages from all over our nation, from people of all walks of life and religions, this coming together is what warmed my father's heart in his final days, to see this unity in his nation once again, even if it was over his impending death. My father's funeral was one of great scale in New York. I watched as veterans of both sides marched. And as they placed my father in his casket in the temporary tomb in Riverside Park, on one side were Generals Sherman and Sheridan that had fought the war next to my father. But on the other side, and my father would have appreciated this just as much, was his former enemies, General Buckner and General Johnston. A great sign of unity and respect at the end. Now, our family has been informed that Mr. Drexel, the owner of the cottage on Mount McGregor, intends to leave it as a memorial to my father with all its contents. I'm sure that my father will have memorials made to him in many places across our nation, but I believe that the memorial of the cottage will be unique and it will be fitting. My admiration grew for my father throughout our lives together during his military and political careers, but never more than in this last year. I saw the father I loved struggle, never turning his head from his fate, always concerned about those around him more than himself, compelled solely by a devotion to us, his family. It is truly that unconditional love that will be memorialized by this modest cottage on the mountain. I hope that those who visit take something from my father's character to aspire to. I know if I was half the man that my father was, I would be doing well. In the end, it is my greatest desire that in future generations of visitors to the cottage may learn about General Grant as I knew him and loved him, that they may in turn look upon their own families and loved ones with a renewed spirit of devotion. For it is that which unites us and what truly matters in the end. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions first for Frederick Grant? Does anyone have anything you're wondering about? Anything from 1885 or prior, or anything you would like to ask him? And you're welcome to unmute, or you're also welcome to write into the chat if you'd like.
I would like to ask a question.
Go ahead. Excellent.
I would like to know how Fred would like his father to be remembered in history.
Yes, thank you for that question. And I would like my father to be remembered for multiple things that he did. I of course, focus on him as a father and a loving family man, because that is what I experienced in my life. But I know for many in our nation, he represents a great military leader, a great hero. And I believe his accomplishments as a president are somewhat overshadowed by his accomplishments as a military man. But I think both deserve respect and recognition. So I hope that when people encounter my father's legacy will not be just one of a military hero, will not be just one of a statesman, but also of a loving father. And that all those things, that they know that all those things can occur together.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. One is an inquiry about the image, I believe that is behind you, asking about when that image was captured and some of the context of that.
Yes, this is a relatively late war photo of my father. I must admit, I don't know the exact date of this. This was taken. I believe this is a lithograph, but done from a photograph. My father was photographed many, many times. I remember the photographers at his headquarters. I would argue that my father may be one of the most photographed man on earth at this time. But this is later after he had become Lieutenant General. So this would have been 1864, 65. I would say not quite 66, because he would have had his 4th star. And in this, he's got 3 stars. So he still is Lieutenant General. My father was promoted in 1866 to General of the Army, which is a rank that essentially created for my father. And he did not ask for it, just as he had not asked for any other rank in his career. Very humble as he was. He believed that people should be recognized for their duty that they'd done and recognized for how well they performed and be offered to be promoted, not ask for it. So my father received what he was due.
Where's the question?
I don't know.
Another question from the chat is that asking about if that's a mourning band that you're wearing, and what would be the custom associated with that, particularly as a son of the deceased.
Yes, as you know, we have many customs when it comes to funerals. It is a sign of respect, of course, and especially a military one. And if you look very closely, you will see, I believe this gives us more of a clue. I did not see this previously, but my father is wearing a mourning band. This indicates that this was likely taken within a short period of time after our dear President Lincoln was assassinated. So it is a sign of respect, especially in the military, to wear the armband. And of course, I am not currently in the Army, but I did attend West Point after the war, and I spent time in the West in the service. So I do I'm still referred to as Colonel Grant. And of course, I will re-enter the service just as my father did if my services are needed for this nation in the future.
All right, another question was asking if you yourself spent much time at the White House during your father's presidency.
Yes, I spent some time. I actually served as a secretary for my father for a time, but military duties called me away, and I was away from the White House quite a bit because of those military duties. As I mentioned, after my marriage, my wife Ida did actually spend time staying at the White House with our children in the early years there. And I was away, but I was able to come back and certainly make visits and spend the holidays. So I was privileged to be able to do that. Different members of our family stayed at the White House, including my what was somewhat of an amusing situation because as I explained earlier, there was a bit of locking of horns between my grandfather Grant and my grandfather Dent, and needless to say, they both were in the home at the same time, in the White House at the same time, with their still with their differing political opinions, to say the least. And to see these two older gentlemen go at it in the library, it was quite amusing to some extent.
All right, another question from the chat. Do you know anything, or could you explain a little bit about your father's relationship with Colonel Sherman?
Yes, I'm gonna assume it's General Sherman, I believe. So I'll assume that General Sherman and my father developed a very close bond. I think their relationship during the war probably speaks for itself, a great professional relationship, but I noticed a very close personal relationship as well, very, very close. I remember the times when they were separated, especially during Sherman's march to the sea. As soon as Sherman arrived to meet with my father after that at City Point, it was an incredibly joyous reunion of the two men. So they developed a very deep bond. Both had their struggles in life, deep struggles that General Sherman went through, and both were very abused by the press, we'll say. So they shared some of those struggles in life. But I remember more recently the years just past where Sherman would come to our home in New York and spent a good many visits with my father. So certainly their relationship did not wane after the war either. And Sherman, though he was not at my father's deathbed, he visited him in the very final months before we went to Mount McGregor. And he always has showed our family such great support in these most difficult times. And I remember him being overcome with emotion as my father's casket was placed within the tomb.
Another question coming in about the recovery from the financial recovery from the Ward incident, and also how you made your money.
All of us had investments, Buck, Jesse, and I. We had other investments as well, but we had most of our money tied up in Grant and Ward. And so it financially devastated all of us. It set us all back quite severely. Now I want to keep the record accurate when it comes to Grant and Ward. The impression that my father was a part of it, or was a part of the scheme, is preposterous. He was not, and many accept that as the reality. And also that he was some sort of a naive buffoon when it came to investments. That is not the case either. My father was a very intelligent man, and he was very trusting, and sometimes a bit too trusting. And that did get him into some trouble. People took advantage of his great generosity. But when they went to prosecute Mr. Ward for his crimes, for his scandal, they found it difficult. And it turns out the reason being is because the other investors that were victims, it was not just my brothers and my father and I, it was many other victims, investors, and they did not want to be associated with the scandal. They believed it would make them look bad, so they wouldn't even go to court. They wouldn't even give their testimony. So certainly my father was, and these were I know personally that some of these were great investors of our age, and they are unwilling to admit that they were victims as well. But it was very difficult for my father to be betrayed by Mr. Ward. We do not have concrete plans as of now, but I do know for one sure thing that my father has greatly succeeded in his final endeavor to complete his book. Mr. Twain, as you know, Mr. Mark Twain is our publisher, and he has assured our family that he has already had sales in the hundreds of thousands of titles. And he expects dividends in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for our family. I would give every dollar back to have my father, but he has left us with a great financial legacy, and that will propel us, no doubt, into the future. And he has taken care of not only his children, but I guarantee future generations of Grants.
And that relates directly to another question that came in, asking you to speak to your father's relationship with Samuel Clemens.
Oh, yes. My father seemed like a very reticent man, and he was most of the time, but he did like humor. He enjoyed humor. And he was a bit of a humorous man himself at times. He was very shy and reticent when you first met my father. But when you got to know him, when he was feeling comfortable, he would open up, and he was a great storyteller. And of course, anyone that knows Mr. Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, he is also a great storyteller and well known for it. And my father greatly enjoyed listening to his stories, but also Mr. Twain enjoyed listening to my father's stories as well. Their first meeting was a bit awkward for Mr. Twain. I recall the story where Mr. Twain shook my father's hand at the White House. It was just a gathering that they met at and in the receiving line, and shook my father's hand and said, blurted out just the first thing that came to his mind, which was, "I am embarrassed, are you?" My father let him go at that. A few years later, they would meet again. And on that meeting, my father, with an incredible memory, would say to Mr. Twain, "I'm not embarrassed, are you, Mr. Twain?" So he'd remember that brief meeting from those years before. But the relationship would really blossom after a veterans event. I remember, I believe it was in Chicago. Mr. Twain was the very last speaker of the night, and the room was full of veterans. And of course, veterans would defend my father's honor to the very last. And Twain was a little nervous. He admitted later on that, his joke was a little bit of an edgy one. And he had decided that he was going to portray my father as a little baby child and trying to get his big toe into his mouth. And his punchline at the end of his joke was that if the man is anything like the child succeeded in getting the digit into his mouth. And of course, he looked across the crowd and saw a sea of veterans just waiting. And he was on daggers waiting to see what would happen next. And all of a sudden, from behind him on the stage was General Grant. And he let out a laugh, an audible laugh, something not very typical of my father. And Mr. Twain thought that was the greatest achievement of his life. And for many years after, Mr. Twain lived in Hartford, Connecticut, but kept an apartment in the city. And he considered it a privilege to come to our home and visit my father as much as he could. And it was a great heartbreak for him when my father passed. But at the same time, he was grateful that he was allowed to help my father in his final endeavor to finish his book. In fact, it would be Twain that at the darkest moments of uncertainty, and my father, being a modest man, believed he would never be much of an author, but it was Mr. Twain that would tell him that he was, and that people would read his book. And so he inspired confidence in my father just at a time when it was waning. And so he, in his brilliant method of selling my father's book, resulted in his ability to come to the cottage only a few weeks before my father's death. And my father wrote a note to him asking him, inquiring the most important thing a dying man could ask: is this going to make enough to take care of my family? And it was at that moment that Mr. Twain was able to look at my father and tell him, "Do not worry, General. We have already sold 100,000 copies. We have been selling them door to door, using veterans to sell their commander's book door to door across our nation." And this allowed Mr. Twain to be able to relieve my father's final anxieties at the end and to help provide for our family. So we are greatly indebted to Mr. Twain.
All right, another question that has come in is a question about President Grant's alcohol consumption, and wondering if you'd be willing to speak to some of the rumors related to that.
Well, it certainly gets a lot of attention. My father didn't see fit to include it in his memoirs. Of course, I helped him on his book, and it was something that he did not see fit to put in his book. And to me, him doing that was not him escaping any kind of shame. I believe that my father's relationship with alcohol is nowhere near what those who would be his enemies make it out to be. I believe it was something that he may have struggled with for a brief time, and is especially in that period of time I mentioned earlier, when he was separated from his family, dealing with intense loneliness and mental anguish on the West Coast. Of course, if you spend any time in the military of today, and this is not to badmouth our military in any way, but if you spend any time, you will, and go through any camp, you will find individuals who are consuming alcohol. The drink is prolific among the troops, whether it is approved or is not. That is just something happens, wartime or not. That being said, my father had great powers of self-control, and he knew that he had an issue with alcohol, that he was not able to consume much without it affecting him and his abilities. Some men I have seen drink great amounts and it does not affect them, but my father was not of that type. He was a very light drinker, but if he drank any more than lightly, it could affect his abilities. And so he made sure to stay away from alcohol most of the time I spent with him. And I believe that he was successful during his life at moderating his drink consumption. So I believe it is an overblown subject from my personal experience with my father.
Another question, the individual states, your father's administration is considered to have been filled with corruption, not at all because your father was corrupt, but because he trusted in the people around him, that they were good people to a fault. Your thoughts on this?
Well, as I have mentioned earlier, my father was trusting, and that in and of itself is not a fault, but people who take advantage of that are at fault. But it can be turned into a weakness by who are less scrupulous. So my father achieved many great things for our nation during his presidency. It is sad that the newspapers and the reformists, that their calls, the way that they've recorded my father's presidency will sadly likely be the way that it will be remembered. And that is because scandal, as big or little as it is, makes for good newspaper print. And I think that is where the origin of most of these generalizations about my father's presidential terms come from, is because the financial gains and the diplomatic gains of my father's administration and the many other advancements of our nation during his terms are overshadowed by these. So my father, I believe, is the victim of history being written in a very biased sense. And hopefully someday there will be a correction of this, and that my father, of course, is very well loved even to this day, but he's not given all the credit even today that he deserves for his political career. I don't believe that he was naive. I don't believe that I know him well enough to know he was not naive. I believe, and though he was trusting to the point where he could be taken advantage of, I don't believe that he was gullible. So I believe my father dealt with the corruption when it was discovered. He wanted, in his own words, all guilty, let no guilty man escape from any of these. He did want this corruption prosecuted, the Department of Justice created, and my father did put forth measures to address the corruption, some of it that existed before he took office. So there are many circumstances that are involved, but I believe that my father did very well as a president and did his duty to his country as a president, and brought our country through a very difficult period. There was periods in the decades following the war here that our nation was not secure. It was not sure whether or not civil war would break out again. And so my father had to deal with that, as well as potential foreign wars. So these are major things that my father had to address, all while the nation is lurching forward into a new era, as we know, of technological advancements. So I believe my father overall did a great job as a president for his nation.
All right. Do we have one more question for Frederick himself? Anyone who would like to speak up? If not, we can move on to any questions that we might have for Ben. Anyone who wants to jump in at this point? All right, so I guess we can open it up to questions for Ben and about Grant's Cottage, and any sort of questions from more of a modern perspective. Okay, I see a couple of people unmuted, so I just wanted to see if there's anyone who wanted to jump in with that. I don't see anything in the chat at the moment, but anyone, any other questions either way for Frederick or Ben?
Hi, this is Jim Richmond.
Hi, Jim.
How you doing? Hey, this is a great job. I mean, you're a natural. You should be on the History Channel. Maybe you can just explain a little bit. I'm kind of interested in what the upcoming programs are at the Cottage this year. What have you got planned?
Well, thanks, Jim, for teeing me up for some promotion. I appreciate that. Well, thanks everybody for coming as well this evening. I appreciate that, and I try to do justice to Fred Grant as a person who lived on this earth, and I try to do justice to that when I do living history presentations, and it's a work in progress, trying to assume the persona of someone else. But, you know, we all, you know, we have similar humanity, and that's what I try to tap into. And that's what interests me about history, is just, you know, especially living history, is knowing that these people had hopes and dreams, and they felt like us, and they, you know, we all share human nature. And I think there's something to learn about that, and some connection we can make to the past. As far as what we're doing this year at the Cottage, we're excited. It's the 200th anniversary of Grant's birth this year, 1822 to 2022. So we're having bicentennial celebrations. These include June 18th, which is going to be a family day. We're going to have music. We're going to have it's a birthday celebration. So we're having birthday, you know, children's activities, games, face painting. You know, we're going to have some, living historians. We're going to have we're going to have music there, period music. So that's going to be a fun one. That's on Saturday, June 18th. These are just a couple of the highlights. We'll be doing kind of a hybrid program, half online, some stuff on site for July 23rd, which is Remembrance Day. That's the date General Grant died at the Cottage. We're also going to have a fall event, which is October 16th, which is not on site, but we're going to have it in Saratoga, and that will be the gala. You can find some. That's a fundraising event. That's a gala, and we're going to have some interesting speakers for that. So I encourage people to check out our website at grantcottage.org to find out more about that as we get closer to that date. Throughout the season, we'll have other programs. We open April 30th, Saturday, April 30th. We'll be open Friday through Sunday, the month of May, then 5 days a week in the summer. And then we'll also be back to weekends in the fall, in September and early October. You can get tickets right online. And I do encourage it, actually. We are back to pre-COVID numbers that we can have on tours. So that should help a little bit. But it's always good if you have a certain time you want to come and get a tour, go ahead and pick up your ticket ahead of time. And it's a beauty, you know, if you haven't been through the Cottage, it is a fascinating time capsule history. It's a smaller space, but it just has some very unique, one of a kind, fascinating artifacts. And of course, well, I'm a little biased, obviously, but there's, but it's also got a wonderful, just a heartwarming story of love. And, it's a tragedy, but there's so much love there and such a family story. And that's what we really, we try to highlight there is the connections, the relevance of the people that came before us and how their lives similar, they reflect our lives today. And so that's something you can experience. There's beautiful overlook if you've never been there, beautiful view of the Hudson Valley, wonderful visitor center gift shop. So if you haven't been up there, we definitely want you to come up, come and see us this season. And we'd love to have you.
All right. It looks like you covered a couple of the questions that just came into the chat. One was about opening of the cottage this year. A specific question with that is
Sure.
whether there will be any porch chats this year.
Yeah, it's a good thing. We are actually moving away from the term. We've, more or less we found out from the from the architects, let's say, that the porch can only take so many people. You got beams under there. So, we porch chats were quaint and they were wonderful when we did them, and we may still stage some things on the porch at times. But we've gotten away from that as a term. That being said, we definitely are going to have people present. We are going to have some in-person. It's a mixture this year of programming. We're going to have some in-person, and we are going to have some virtual, just as you're doing it at Brookside. So we're going to have a number of in-person programs this year. And I believe we have a program on birds. So it's not all just history. We have some programs on some other subjects as well. We have a nice tent that will be going up that will, on the property, which is going to be new this year. We're going to do our programming under. Nice open air, kind of situation there, not far from the cottage. And so we are still going to do the porch chats. We just don't call them that anymore. But we're still having authors, speakers, and presenters out there to do some programming for us. So I think we're somewhere around 11 or 12 programs this year. So you can check out those programs. They're going to be, I don't know if they're up yet, but they're very close to going up on the website soon, grantcottage.org. So you can put them on your calendar real soon. And we'll look for, and of course we'll post them on our Facebook page as they get close. We promote through Facebook as well, but our website's the best place to go to check that out.
All right, excellent. And we do have a question about your specific role at Grant Cottage. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, well, it's an exciting time to be part of the organization. We have, in the last 10 years, we have grown 160% in visitation. So meaning I can't, realistically, I can't even be what I was 8 years ago there. It's not even possible. We have so much more going on and so many wonderful projects and improvements to the site that are either done or planned. We've done a lot with the visitor center, all that. That being said, we have a small paid staff. We're a nonprofit, the Friends of Grant Cottage. We operate the site on behalf of the owners, who are the New York State Parks Department. Now, we are also a National Historic Landmark. Now, that doesn't make us a national park. That's a different thing, but we are recognized by the National Park Service as a very important place, as a landmark. And of course, that opens us up to federal funding. My duties on site as one of the very few staff members that we have there, I'm year round, there's a few, we do seasonal as well, is volunteer management, as well as, the main ones, obviously, so you may find me unclogging a toilet at any given time on site, but the main one, or shoveling snow, but the main ones during the, our volunteer management and, staff, making sure this site is staffed and doing outreach programs like this, taking tours. We do have living history tours available. I didn't mention that. We have some new experiences that we're bringing back this year. One is living history tours. They're a little longer. And And so we're doing those, as well as history hikes, where we actually don't go into the house, but we actually deal with the history of, we hike around the property. We talk about the history all the way from the Native Americans all the way to the prison. So that gives people a different experience on the site. And that's something we'll be debuting again this year. Again, giving people different ways to experience the site and learn more about the mountain history as well. So my job ends up being multiple different things. I get involved in interpretation, collections. With being such a small staff, we end up wearing a number of hats, not just this one. There's a number of hats that we all wear. So it's a challenge. It is a challenge, like any small nonprofit is, but it's a wonderful opportunity, and the challenge is worth it. And we got some wonderful stuff, exciting stuff planned for the future here in the next few years, and we're going to need everybody's support to do it. To take our historic site to the next level and be able to accommodate more and more people. And so it's an exciting time. People are giving General Grant a second look. He's not just the cigar smoking, tough guy, whiskey drinking, lousy president, whatever. He's getting a second look as for what he did for our nation. I think, we play a really pivotal role in that as a historic site. We get to give people a better perspective of the man. And that's our real mission there, is to give people a proper perspective of history and what happened there. And I think we're doing a good job of that. We have some great volunteers. If anybody's interested, we're always looking for more people to contribute, to become part of the Grant Cottage team. You can fill out an application right on our website. So, if that's something you think you might be interested in, we have tour guiding and many other opportunities as well that if tour guiding is not your cup of tea. So certainly if you want to get involved, memberships, different things like that, but donations, but certainly, there's many ways to support what we do.
Excellent. In addition to the many accolades and thank yous for a great presentation, there's, and people have been saying, a great session, great way to tell a story. There's one last question that I think would be a great way to wrap things up. So if people want to learn more, what books would you say are most helpful, and what would you recommend if you wanted to learn more about Grant himself or the family or anything like that?
Hey, that's why I do it. That's why I do this, because really the fact that somebody's asking that is perfect. That means that I've sparked a little interest to learn more, and that's what this is all about. And I appreciate that question. It depends on what type of an experience you want to have. If you want to get a good broad overview of General Grant as a person from life to death, you can't read his memoirs, because he never did the end of his life. It's a great read. His memoirs are a great read, but it's a military memoir. Almost the entire thing is military. So you have to know that going into it. It's well written. It's an amazing piece of literature, but and if you're going to get that, get the annotated version, the newer version, if you're going to get that, because it explains all the stuff he's talking about. General so-and-so, who's that? It'll explain it in the margin. So get the annotated version. We have discount copies up at the Cottage. If you're going for a biography, the newer ones are better, definitely better. I prefer, Ron White, American Ulysses. There's one by Ron Chernow as well, which is called just plain Grant, which is very popular, but it is very long too. It's a lot to get through. I would say Ron White's American Ulysses is a little bit more digestible, a little shorter, about 600 pages, and hits all the high notes. It's a good broad overview. Me personally, when you get into the point when you actually want to learn more about Grant, you can't do that in a biography. The guy had an amazing 63-year life, right? So in order to get that, you have to start dipping into books that were written about specific parts of Grant's life. There's some wonderful books out there about specific, about his world tour. There's books about his relationship with the Native Americans. There's books about, his early life. Something called Captain Sam Grant. Some of these are not even in normal print anymore, but they're wonderful books. Again, biographies usually win out on the store shelves. But if you look, you can get these on eBay, different places. We have quite a few available at our gift shop as well. But yeah, recommendations. There's a lot of books written on Grant. But I would say whatever you're most interested in him, if it's a specific subject, I would go right for that subject and look to see if there's a book written on that particular subject. Grant's final year, there's a number of books on Grant's last year. My favorite is Grant's Final Victory by Charles Braceland Flood. Very short book, 200 and some odd pages, beautifully written, very powerful. It's it's very evocative. It's heart-wrenching, but it's really good. It's my favorite book on Grant. As amazing as that sounds, it's only his last year, but it really pulls it all together and shows you who the man was. So I do recommend that book for the last year of Grant's life. Julia Grant, if you're interested in women's history of the Victorian era, Julia's memoirs are very good for that. She wrote her own memoirs. They weren't published until something like 70 years after her death, but the manuscript was published in the 70s, and that's available. The personal memoirs of Julia Dent Grant, so that's available. That's still in print. So that's if you want to learn a little bit more about the family too, you can do that.
All right, wonderful. And I think that was a great way to sort of tie up the presentation. And I know I enjoyed this very much. And again, in the chat, many people are sharing their thanks for a wonderful presentation. So again, I want to thank everyone for being here this evening, and certainly check out Grant Cottage's website, Brookside's website, and keep in mind all those great upcoming events at both sites. So again, thanks for being here and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great.